The smell hit you before anything else. Scorched mahogany and burning wool and something older beneath both. Something sulfurous and primordial that had no business existing on the 67th floor of a glass and steel tower. Something that made the lizard brain in every human present scream a single, primal instruction. Run. The air in the boardroom of the obsidian spire shimmered with visible heat, warping the edges of the floor-to-ceiling windows the way asphalt warps in a summer drought. And the long mahogany conference table, the one that had been custom-milled from a single tree felled in an old-growth forest and shipped across an ocean at the cost of a modest house, was beginning to blacken along its far edge. Not from an open flame. From proximity alone. From the man standing at the head of it. Balthazar Vance had not raised his voice in the last 4 minutes, and that was somehow the most terrifying part. He stood with both fists pressed to the table surface, the posture of a man pretending to be still, every tendon in his neck carved into sharp relief, his jaw a hard architectural line beneath a face that belonged on a classical frieze rather than in a corporate boardroom. He was enormous, not in the paunchy, self-satisfied way of men who confused wealth with size, but in the manner of something built for a purpose long before civilization had a word for purpose. 6 feet and 4 inches of dense, layered muscle beneath a charcoal suit that had cost more than most people's cars. Shoulders broad enough to cast genuine shade. Hands that looked as though they could close around a steering column and simply bend it. His hair was dark and swept back from his face, and his eyes were the problem. His eyes were the color of heated copper, that specific violent amber that appears in metal just before it liquefies, and they did not blink. The cuffs of his shirt were on fire. Not metaphorically. Not smoldering. There were actual, small, insistent tongues of flame eating at the white fabric above each wrist, and the 6 executives seated around the conference table had collectively decided that mentioning this was not their responsibility. 3 of them had pressed themselves as far back in their chairs as the leather would allow. 1 had slid a full foot down his seat, as though attempting to gradually disappear beneath the table. The chief financial officer, a woman with 20 years of boardroom experience and a reputation for nerves forged in iron, had her hand pressed flat against her sternum and was breathing in the careful, deliberate way of someone managing a medical event. The Velantris deal, Balthazar said, very quietly, was mine. Nobody answered. The correct answer, that the deal had collapsed because 3 regulatory filings had been submitted with errors, that the competitor had moved faster, that this was recoverable, was technically available to every person in the room, and every person in the room had independently decided that speaking it aloud was not survivable. The edge of the mahogany table let out a soft creak and developed a new blackened stripe. 14 months, he continued, and his voice was low and even and terrifying the way the pressure drop before a tornado is terrifying, not loud, but fundamentally wrong. 14 months of cultivation, of patience. I do not practice patience. I do not. He paused, and the temperature in the room climbed another perceptible degree, and the sprinkler heads in the ceiling made a small, strained sound as the heat sensors inside them began to argue with their own calibration. I do not lose acquisitions. The elevator at the far end of the room chimed. The sound was incongruously clean and bright, a small, cheerful tone completely unsuited to its surroundings, and every head in the room turned toward it with the desperate gratitude of people hoping for any interruption whatsoever. The doors slid open with a soft hydraulic exhale. The click of heels on marble was unhurried. She did not rush. That was the first thing, and it was the most disorienting thing, because every human instinct in a room this hot, with a man this dangerous at the center of it, demanded urgency, demanded that any new entrant either retreat or move with the frantic efficiency of emergency response. She did neither. The sound of her heels was deliberate and even, and completely without apology, each step placed with the casual precision of a woman who owned the floor she walked on, even when she did not. And the executives swiveled to watch her approach with the particular helpless attention of people observing something they cannot categorize. Sloane Ellis was 34 years old and looked it in the best possible way. Not young in the soft, unfinished sense, but sharp with it, refined, the way a blade looks better once it has been properly honed. She was tall and lean in a slate-gray suit that had been tailored to within a millimeter of her measurements, the jacket cut close through the shoulders and waist, the fabric doing something quietly extraordinary in the way it moved. Her hair was the color of winter wheat and worn up in a twist so precise it looked architectural. Her face was the kind of face that stopped conversations, clean-lined, symmetrical, with pale eyes the exact shade of sea ice that seemed to absorb and return light at the same time. She was, objectively and without any emotional valence attached to the observation, stunning. She looked completely and utterly bored. The heat in the room was a physical force, the kind that dries your eyes and tightens the skin across your cheekbones, and she walked through it the way you walk through air conditioning, acknowledging it, unbothered by it. She did not loosen her collar. She did not touch her face. Her expression did not change. She carried a slim leather folio in one hand and wore no watch, which somehow made her the only person in the room who appeared to have all the time she needed. She did not look at Balthazar as she passed the first cluster of executives. She looked at the credenza along the left wall, where a full service of crystal glasses and a condensation-slicked pitcher of iced sparkling water had been sweating quietly since the start of the meeting, and she redirected her path toward it with no particular hurry. "Miss Ellis," the CFO managed, her voice climbing slightly, "perhaps now is not the ideal—" "It's fine," Sloane said, in the tone of someone who has assessed the situation and determined that it is, in fact, fine, and does not feel the need to elaborate further. She poured a glass of sparkling water. She selected one with the maximum ratio of ice to liquid, and then added a second pour, filling it to the rim. Then she turned and walked directly toward Balthazar Vance, and if she noticed that his eyes had shifted from the middle distance to her face, with the locked, unblinking attention of a very large apex predator that has identified something new in its territory, she gave no indication of it. He watched her come. Something had shifted in his expression. Not softened, not settled, but reconfigured, the way a storm system reconfigures when it encounters an unexpected pressure front. His hands were still flat on the table. The flames at his cuffs had climbed another half-inch. Sloane stopped at his left side, set her folio down on the table with a crisp, quiet sound, reached over, and poured the entire glass of iced, sparkling water directly over his forearms. The sound it made was violent. Steam erupted from both sleeves in a sudden sharp billow, white and opaque, carrying the smell of extinguished fire and cold mineral water, and something else beneath that. The older, stranger smell, muted now, dampened. The ice cubes scattered across the blackened table surface and skittered toward the edge. Balthazar did not move. Not a flinch, not a recoil, not so much as a shift of weight. He was simply still, for the first time since the meeting had begun, in the manner of a very powerful machine whose power has been, temporarily, interrupted. The 6 executives stared. Balthazar stared. Sloane set the empty glass down on the table beside her folio, straightened, and looked at him for the first time, directly, with those pale, icy eyes. And the look said nothing beyond, "Yes, I did that, and I would do it again. And I have a schedule." "You're Balthazar Vance," she said. It was not a question. Her voice was even and clear, and had a quality to it like a well-tuned instrument. No unnecessary warmth, no affected cool, simply correct, each word placed where it belonged. Balthazar's jaw moved slightly. The amber in his eyes had intensified to something almost luminous. He was looking at her the way he might look at something he had never encountered before, cataloging it, and there was nothing human in the assessment. "You poured water on me," he said, at last. "Your cuffs were on fire," Sloane replied, with the particular patience of someone explaining something to a person who should already understand it. The fire suppression system in this building was 6 seconds from activating. The resulting water and chemical damage to this floor would have been significant, and more importantly, it would have generated a report that someone in city compliance would have read. She held his gaze without apparent effort. "You've had a difficult morning. I understand that. We're going to fix it." Another silence. The steam from his sleeves had thinned to nothing. The mahogany table continued to cool. "Who?" Balthazar said, very carefully. "Are you?" Sloane opened her folio. From it she withdrew 2 documents, a single-page damage assessment form, printed on heavy stock, with 12 neat fields and a line at the bottom, and a contract, multiple pages, bound with a small metal clip. She placed them side by side on the table in front of him, with the efficiency of someone who has done this many times, in many boardrooms, under many varieties of extraordinary pressure. "My name is Sloane Ellis," she said. "I'm the principal of Ellis Crisis Group. You were referred by Arden Westfall Capital, whose senior partner has now used my firm on 4 separate occasions, most recently after his CFO drove a company helicopter into a parking structure." She tapped the assessment form once with one finger. "This is a standard intake document. It covers the scope of the Velantris acquisition collapse, any subsidiary media exposure, and the status of any regulatory inquiries that may result." She moved her finger to the contract. "This is our engagement agreement. My firm will take over public communications management for Vance Holdings effective immediately and will manage all crisis response strategy for a period of not less than 90 days. The terms are on page 2. My retainer is non-negotiable." Balthazar had not looked at the documents. He was still looking at her. His expression had undergone several quiet revolutions in the past 90 seconds, cycling through categories of response she suspected he rarely needed to access, and had arrived at something she had seen before in powerful men, though never quite so concentrated, never quite so ancient as this. He was fascinated. She was aware of it. She did not file it under relevant. "You walked into this room," he said, slowly, as though reconstructing something from memory, "while you were in the process of damaging your own property and frightening your own staff, yes." She did not say it unkindly. She said it the way you say a true thing. "And you were not." He paused. "Afraid?" she asked. She considered the question for one honest second. "No." The word landed in the space between them with a quality that was almost physical. He was standing at full height now, no longer braced against the table, and from this proximity she was fully aware of the scale of him, the sheer spatial claim of his presence, the heat that still radiated from his skin in waves that should not have been possible. The way the air near him felt pressurized, changed. A person who had not done this job for 9 years might have stepped back. Sloane did not step back. She picked up the contract and held it out to him. "Velantris will be in secondary press rotation by end of week," she said. "The regulatory inquiry can be managed. Your public profile can absorb this. But only if we start now." Balthazar Vance looked at the contract in her hand. He looked at her face. Something moved through the copper amber of his eyes. Not quite calculation, not quite what she would have called emotion, but something older and more fundamental than either. The way a tide is older and more fundamental than the weather that drives it. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his ruined jacket and produced a pen. It was heavy, flat-sided, made entirely of gold that looked hand-worked, with an edge worn smooth in the way of something handled daily for a very long time. He uncapped it, turned to the contract on the table, found the signature line without being shown it, and signed. The signature was not what she expected. It was not the self-important scrawl of corporate power or the hasty scratch of someone conceding a point. It was deliberate and old, and struck her as the signature of a person who had always understood that a signature was a binding thing. He straightened and looked at her. "You are not like other crisis managers," Balthazar said. Sloane clipped the signed contract back into her folio and closed it. "No," she agreed, in the same tone she'd used for everything else. "Even, clean, utterly without performance. I'm not. That's why you signed." She picked up the folio. "I'll need your calendar access and your communications director on a call by 3 o'clock. If you have a communications director." A brief, appraising pause. "We'll discuss that possibility either way." She turned and walked back toward the elevator, past the 6 executives who were staring at her with an assortment of expressions ranging from relief to something close to reverence, her heels marking their unhurried cadence against the marble floor. Behind her, in the cooling ruin of his boardroom, Balthazar Vance watched her go. He was very still. The temperature in the room had dropped a full 10 degrees without his noticing. His predator's instincts, older than the building he stood in by roughly 2,000 years, had just identified something that did not exist in any of his prior experience of the world. Something that met his heat with cold rather than flight. Something that did not shrink. Something that could not be purchased or frightened or overwhelmed. Those instincts, honed across centuries into a precise and ruthless instrument for identifying the most valuable thing in any given space, had reached a verdict with unusual speed. He looked at the closed elevator doors. He looked at the assessment form she had left on the table, the one still waiting for his answers. He sat down, very slowly, and picked up his gold pen. The first lighter was confiscated on a Tuesday. Balthazar had produced it during a strategy session, in the manner of a man who had reached for the same object 10,000 times without once being challenged on it. A reflex. Automatic. The gold case catching the light as his thumb moved toward the wheel. He was not a smoker. He had never been a smoker. The lighter existed because fire was familiar to him in the way breathing is familiar to most people, and the small controlled flame produced a sensation of regulation, of management, the way some people uncap and recap a pen when they're thinking. Sloane reached across the conference table and took it out of his hand. She did not ask. She did not explain herself in the moment. She simply removed it from his grip with the decisive efficiency of a flight attendant confiscating an oversized carry-on, placed it in the outer pocket of her folio, and returned her attention to the media timeline she had been building on the whiteboard. The room had 5 people in it, including 2 members of Balthazar's communications staff who had been hired the previous Thursday at Sloane's direction, and all 4 of the other humans held extremely still. Balthazar stared at his empty hand. "That," he said, "is a solid gold Zephyr pattern lighter. It is one of 4 in existence. I have owned it for—" "It's a fire hazard and a liability," Sloane said, without turning from the whiteboard. "The Velantris press cycle runs through end of week. If you ignite anything in this building before we get through the financial quarter review, I will have you in front of a journalist before you can get a new one, and that journalist will have questions I have not yet prepared you to answer." She wrote something on the board. "You'll get it back in 90 days. Possibly." The word possibly was delivered with the exact same inflection as everything else she said, which was the most unsettling part. There was no particular threat in it. There was simply a complete and unambiguous communication of reality, as she had assessed it. Balthazar pressed his palms flat to the table in a gesture that she had come to recognize, in the 2 weeks since their initial meeting, as the precursor to a significant temperature event. She turned from the whiteboard, crossed to the credenza along the wall, and returned with a tall glass of iced coffee, condensation already running down the sides, 3 ice cubes wide, cold enough that a thin layer of frost had formed at the rim, and placed it in front of him. He looked at it. He looked at her. "Hold it," she said. "I am not a child." "No. You're a man with a documented tendency to set things on fire when he's frustrated, and I have a media cycle to protect." She held his gaze without flinching. Hold the glass, Mr. Vance. There was a long moment. The temperature in the room, which had been climbing in that subtle, pressure-building way she had learned to detect in the first 3 days, the way a room gets close before a storm, plateaued and then, incrementally, descended. Balthazar wrapped one large hand around the iced coffee glass. The frost on the rim began to melt slightly from his body heat alone. He did not drink it. He simply held it, and the room returned to something a reasonable thermostat could manage. The communications staff exhaled. This was, she had discovered, a workable system. The lighters numbered 4 by the end of the second week, the Zephyr in her folio pocket, a flat rectangular case made of hammered gold that she found in his desk, a third that he produced from somewhere during a particularly contentious phone call with a media lawyer and that she intercepted mid-gesture, and a fourth, older than the others, plain and worn smooth at the edges in the way of something genuinely ancient, that had appeared in his hand during a board meeting and which she had point removed without comment while he was mid-sentence. That one she placed separately, in a different compartment of her bag, and said nothing about it, because she had noted the way his hand had closed around it for the half-second before she took it, and she was not interested in unnecessary escalation. She was managing a crisis. She understood that the crisis, in this particular case, had 2 dimensions: the external, which was the Velantris collapse, and the regulatory exposure, and the media narrative, and the internal, which was the man himself, and that the internal required at least as much technical precision as the external. What she had not accounted for, and what began to manifest by the end of the 3rd week, was that the man himself had begun treating her management of him as an object of fascination that seemed to be intensifying rather than normalizing. Balthazar Vance, she was learning, had a relationship with valuable things that went well beyond the acquisitive tendencies of ordinary wealthy men. She had worked with billionaires before, had managed the public images of venture capitalists and shipping magnates and inherited wealth family patriarchs, and she understood the psychology of accumulation, the way certain men formed attachments to assets that other people would classify as objects. But his relationship with value was different in a way she found difficult to categorize, because it was not about display. He did not show his possessions off. He cataloged them. He arranged them. He checked on them with the quiet, periodic attention of something that needed to verify its hoard was intact. And there was in that behavior a very old anxiety that had nothing to do with money. He had begun doing the same thing with her. She noticed it first in the meetings. He was always already in the room when she arrived, positioned so that he faced the door, and his eyes found her the moment she crossed the threshold. Not in the way men sometimes watched her, the appraisal of her appearance, the assessment of her in the way of a transaction being considered, but in the way he watched the lighter case when he thought no one was looking. A checking on. A verification that the thing was still there. He had begun attending meetings he had previously delegated entirely to staff. He appeared in the doorway of her temporary office on the 43rd floor. She had declined to work on the 67th, citing the heat regulation issue, and he had agreed to this without argument, which she filed under notable. At intervals throughout the day, occupying the doorframe with his considerable dimensions and asking questions that she recognized, after the 2nd or 3rd occurrence, as questions that had already been answered in that morning's briefing document. She answered them again, each time, without comment. She was not paid to comment on his motives. She was paid to manage his crisis. But she was also, by profession and by temperament, a reader of situations, and what she was reading in the way he positioned himself near her, always slightly closer than necessary, always oriented toward her, always with that specific quality of attention, that ancient and focused stillness, suggested that the crisis she had been hired to manage was undergoing a significant expansion in scope. He stood at her shoulder, during a media prep session on a Thursday afternoon, leaning over the table to look at the briefing sheet she was annotating. And the heat from his proximity was a tangible pressure along her right side, like standing near an industrial oven with a door left open. She could feel it through her suit jacket. She continued annotating the briefing sheet. "You are standing 6 inches from me," she said, without looking up. "I'm reviewing the document," he said. "The document is also available on the copy I provided you." She indicated it with the tip of her pen, his copy, sitting untouched at his designated seat on the other side of the table. He did not move. She could hear something in his breathing. Not quite a sound, but a quality, a depth, the way a large animal breathes when it is doing something other than simply existing. After a moment she looked up, and he was watching her from that 6-inch distance with those copper-amber eyes, and the expression on his face was one she had never seen directed at her by another person. And she had been in rooms with some extraordinary people. He looked at her the way he looked at the older lighter, like something irreplaceable, like something he was quietly and completely restructuring his priorities around. "Mr. Vance," she said, evenly. "You think in 17 dimensions simultaneously," he said, which was not a response to her addressing him. "I watched you rebuild the Volantris narrative in 48 hours. You anticipated the secondary regulatory inquiry before the regulator had filed the preliminary notice. He stopped. He appeared to be experiencing something that required a moment to process. "I have 3 metric tons of high-grade gold ore in a vault below this building," he said, and his voice had a quality she had not heard before in it, something stripped of its usual performance of control, something almost wondering. "I have held it for longer than this country has existed. And I would trade it—" He stopped again. Sloane set down her pen. She looked at him for one measured second. She had worked in crisis management for 9 years. She had been in rooms where people said things under pressure that they had not intended to say, where the stress of exposure stripped away the careful management of the self, and she had learned to neither flinch from those moments nor encourage them. "Finish your thought," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said, and the control came back, smooth and immediate, like a shutter closing. He picked up his copy of the briefing sheet and walked to his side of the table and sat down. She picked up her pen. The island offer arrived on a Friday, in the form of a single document placed on her desk by Balthazar's executive assistant, who delivered it with the expression of someone who had been given an assignment they had decided not to have opinions about. The document was a formal transfer of title. The island was called Werewolf, located in a warm water archipelago in a sea that did not see significant traffic, and it was, by the attached assessment, approximately 700 acres of forested coastline with an existing structure and a private anchorage. The transfer was made out in her name, unconditionally, with no return consideration requested. Sloane read the document from top to bottom, including the appendices. She went to find Balthazar. He was in his office on the 67th floor, standing at the window with his hands behind his back, looking out over the city of Ethelgard in the late afternoon light with the posture of something surveying territory. He turned when she entered, and something in his expression, a careful, prepared stillness, told her he had been expecting this visit and had spent time thinking about how it would go. She placed the document on his desk. "Werewolf," she said, "has not filed a valid environmental impact statement in the current regulatory cycle. The existing structure has undeclared modifications made to the shoreline access that are technically in violation of Maritime Preservation Code, which means the title is encumbered by a potential remediation liability that is not reflected in the assessment. The property tax filing is 18 months in arrears with the relevant island authority." She paused. "More significantly, accepting a gift asset of this value from a current client would constitute a material conflict of interest under my firm's engagement terms, which you signed." She tapped the document once. "And even if it didn't, I do not accept gifts." Balthazar had not moved. He was watching her with those lit, copper eyes, and the expression of a man receiving information through a medium he was not accustomed to using. "It is an island," he said, with the quality of someone who feels they may not have been understood. 700 acres. There is a— "I know what it is," Sloane said. "The answer is no. I am offering you— You're offering me a tax liability and a regulatory problem dressed in a deed of title." She picked up the document and held it out to him. "Have your property counsel address the arrearage and the shoreline modifications and file the impact statement, and then sell it through appropriate channels, because the carrying cost on that asset is eating into capital you should be deploying differently." She held his gaze. "We have a morning briefing at 7:45 tomorrow. The Velantris secondary coverage breaks at 9, and I need you available and temperature stable." She set the document on the desk herself, turned, and walked to the door. Behind her, she heard nothing. Not a word, not a movement, not the displacement of air that accompanied most humans when they shifted their weight or reconfigured their stance. Just the particular charged quality of total stillness that she had come to associate with Balthazar Vance at the outer edge of his processing capacity. She pulled the door open. "Miss Ellis," he said. She paused, her hand on the door, but did not turn around. He did not say anything else. After a moment, she continued through the door and pulled it closed behind her with a soft, precise click. In the office, Balthazar looked at the island title on his desk. Then he looked at the closed door. He reached into his suit jacket and found the absence of the lighter without surprise, a reflex checking an empty pocket with the resigned familiarity of something he had begun to accept, and stood with the late Ethelgard light falling across his shoulders and the document sitting on the desk in front of him, and felt something move through the deep, ancient architecture of his chest that 2,000 years of accumulated instinct struggled to name. Because it was not acquisition, and it was not dominance, and it was not the satisfaction of any need he had previously recognized as a need. It was the specific and entirely new sensation of wanting something that could not be taken, could not be bought, could not be claimed by any of the methods available to him. It was, he was slowly and furiously beginning to understand, the most interesting problem he had ever encountered in his very long life. He sat down behind the desk, pulled the island title toward him, and reached for a pen. He would have his counsel address the arrearage. The alarm did not sound like an alarm. It sounded like a small, polite notification. A single tone, repeated twice, from the security panel mounted beside the elevator on the 43rd floor. And Sloane Ellis looked up from the media response draft she had been reviewing at 11:47 on a Wednesday night, and read the panel with the same focused efficiency she applied to everything else. Sublevel 4. Motion sensors. 17 distinct signatures. She saved the document, closed her laptop, and picked up her phone. Balthazar answered on the first ring, which told her he was still awake, which told her nothing she hadn't already assumed. "Someone is in your vault," she said. 3 seconds of silence. Then, "How many?" 17 that the sensors have flagged. Possibly more in the dead zones near the North Corridor. Your coverage has a gap there that I noted in the security audit I submitted to your facilities team 6 weeks ago. She was already moving, pulling on her jacket, her folio under her arm. "Do not go down there alone." The line went dead. She looked at the phone for one moment with an expression that was not surprise and was not quite frustration, but occupied the particular space between them that emerges when a prediction proves accurate slightly faster than anticipated. Then she turned and walked quickly toward the security control room, which she knew the location of because she had made it her business, in the first week of her engagement, to know the location of every system in the obsidian spire that could be used as a lever. The security control room was on sublevel 2, accessible from a staff corridor, and it contained 3 walls of monitors, a central console, and a night shift operator named Dex, who was currently standing with both hands pressed to the console and the expression of a man watching something he did not have a protocol for. "Miss Ellis." "Sit down, Dex," she said, placing her folio on the console and taking the seat beside him. Or stand. Either is fine. But give me access to the environmental management panel. The environmental fire suppression. Ventilation. The tear gas integration that was installed as part of the building's security upgrade last year, and that your team has never had occasion to use. She looked at him. I need access. Dex looked at the monitors where 17 small light signatures were moving through the vault corridors in what was very clearly a practiced, coordinated pattern, and then looked back at Sloane Ellis, who was sitting with her folio open and her posture straight and her pale eyes on the screens with an expression of focused, administrative calm. He gave her access. The vault occupied the entirety of sublevel 4. It was not a safe. It was, in the most accurate sense of the word, a hoard. A space built to Balthazar's specific requirements over the course of the building's construction, with reinforced walls and a climate management system, and corridors designed around dimensions that ordinary secure storage facilities did not require. Sloane had seen the blueprints. She had requested them in week 2 as part of her crisis exposure assessment, on the grounds that any space, with that concentration of high-value assets, represented a reputational liability if it became relevant to a news story. She had not anticipated it becoming relevant quite like this. On the monitors, she could see the mercenaries moving in 2 teams. They were professional. The formation was tight, the communication clearly pre-established. The equipment visible on the cameras included things she could identify as specific. Signal jammers on the belt clips, which explained why the vault's internal alarm hadn't escalated, and cases that 2 of the figures were carrying with the careful, 2-handed grip of people transporting something fragile and valued. Not just a robbery, then. A targeted extraction. Someone had sent them for specific items. She was scanning the corridor schematic and the ventilation grid when the far-right monitor lit up. Balthazar had entered from the service stairwell. She had approximately 3 seconds to assess what she was seeing before she had to revise her working model of the situation rather significantly. He was still wearing the shirt and trousers from the office, jacket gone, and he was moving through the vault corridor with a speed that did not match his size, did not match any human size, with the fluid, purposeful velocity of something that had been doing this for a very long time. But it was not the speed that required the revision. It was the light. His eyes were glowing, not a reflection from the corridor lighting, not a camera artifact. They were generating their own illumination. That copper amber deepened and intensified to the specific color of molten metal at the pore, bright enough to cast a faint light on the walls as he moved, and the air around him showed distortion. The same wavering shimmer she had first encountered in the boardroom, but compressed now, concentrated. A heat aura visible to the camera sensors as a lightening of the pixels around his body. His hands, she noticed, were not quite right. The proportions of the fingers were altered in a way that was subtle and fundamental, and that her mind had to actively push past the cognitive resistance to accept as simply what it was. He was something other than what he showed to the world. She had known this. She had filed it in the same compartment as everything else she had assessed and did not have time to examine in depth. She filed the revision, updated her tactical model, and picked up the comms handset. Balthazar, she said, into the headset she'd taken from the console. I have eyes on you and on all 17 of them. I need you to hold your position at Corridor Junction 3 until I tell you to move. On the monitor, she saw him slow. She saw his head turn slightly, as though orienting to a sound, and then he stopped at the junction. Not in the way a person stops, by decelerating, but in the way a very large machine stops when power is cut, immediately and completely. Ellis, he said, over the comm, and his voice was different, deeper, textured in a way that was not quite human, the way a large instrument sounds different from a small one playing the same note. There are 17, I know, 2 teams. Primary team is moving toward the eastern artifact corridor. Secondary team is covering the exit route and carrying extraction cases. She was pulling up the environmental panel as she spoke. The gap in your camera coverage is being used by 4 of them. I'm going to fix that in approximately 20 seconds. I don't need the cameras. I can hear them. She believed him. She did not say so. The Eastern Artifact Corridor has a fire suppression junction at the ceiling at 8-meter intervals. When I trigger the suppression system in that corridor, the primary team loses visibility and forward movement. That's your window. A pause while she navigated the panel. The secondary team near the north exit has 2 sight lines. I'm going to introduce tear gas through the ventilation at the north junction in 30 seconds. That eliminates the sight lines and forces them to pull back their eye protection, which slows their response time. Silence on the comm. Then, with that altered depth still threading through it, you planned for this. I planned for a range of scenarios. This falls within the range. She found the junction control for the Eastern Corridor suppression system. I'm triggering the Eastern suppression in 10 seconds. Move on my mark. On the monitor, she watched him. Watched the subtle movement of the air around him, the way the camera struggled with the heat distortion emanating from his body. He was very still. He was waiting. The copper light of his eyes was a steady burn. "Mark!" she said, and triggered the junction. The Eastern Corridor monitors went white with discharged suppressant. She switched to thermal imaging and watched the primary team's signatures scatter. 3 moving left, 2 right, 1 going to ground. She watched Balthazar move into the corridor from the junction and felt, even through the abstraction of a camera feed, the violence of what happened in the next 11 seconds. He was not fighting. Fighting was what the mercenaries were doing, trained and coordinated and equipped with things she could now see clearly enough to identify as not entirely conventional. One of them, carrying what the ambient light revealed as a shaped dispersal device, marked with old symbols she did not have a reference for. Balthazar was not fighting. He was resolving. He moved through the suppressant cloud, and the result of each contact was simple and total, and she watched it with the cold, functional attention of a tactician accounting for asset performance. But the Eastern Corridor was 6 people out of 17, and the North team was beginning to move on the extraction cases, and on the right-hand monitor she saw 2 of the remaining team members converging on a position she had not cleared yet, and she saw Balthazar's trajectory carry him away from them. "Balthazar, 2 hostiles, sub-level 4 North Junction, bearing 11 o'clock from your current position. They are 40 seconds from the Eastern Relic Shelf." She pulled up the ventilation controls. "Deploying tear gas at the North Junction now. That cuts their sightline for approximately 90 seconds. "The one with the dispersal case," he said, and she heard something shift in the texture of his voice, something strained and very hot. "What is it?" She looked at the footage. She looked at the symbols on the case. She had not studied the relevant literature extensively, but she had done her exposure research thoroughly, and she knew what she was looking at well enough to understand what it would mean for him, specifically, and for their situation more broadly. "An accelerant countermeasure," she said, "designed to suppress high-temperature output." A pause of exactly 2 seconds. "If they use it, you lose your primary tactical advantage in this space." She heard his breathing change on the comm. The heat distortion on the thermal camera intensified. "Balthazar?" She kept her voice completely level, because this was the most important moment in the current operational window, and she was not going to waste it on escalating his temperature. "I need you to listen to me. They came for my vault." The depth in his voice had shifted into something below language. "They came into my—" "I know, and we are going to address that completely. But I need you present for the next 4 minutes." She watched the North team on the thermal feed, watched the 2 signatures converging on the relic shelf. "The case carrier is moving to intercept you. If you meet him directly, he deploys the suppressant and your options narrow significantly." She pulled up the fire suppression control for the corridor between the case carrier and Balthazar's current position. "I'm going to discharge the suppression junction directly ahead of the case carrier in 5 seconds. That stops his forward movement and gives you lateral approach from his right side, outside the dispersal arc." A pause. "He will not get a second chance to use it. Balthazar said. 3. I know. She found the junction control. 4 seconds. She watched the feed. 3. The case carrier was moving fast, the symbols on the case catching the corridor light. 2. She saw Balthazar position. She saw the quality of stillness that preceded his movement. 1. She triggered the junction. The corridor ahead of the case carrier went. The corridor ahead of the case carrier went white. On the thermal feed, she watched the case carrier's signature stop, divert, try to navigate the suppressant cloud, and she watched Balthazar's signature cross the lateral distance in a time that should not have been possible and make contact. The case did not deploy. She did not permit herself to process the relief. She was already moving to the next problem, which was the 4 signatures in the north blind spot and the secondary team near the exit who had pulled their sight lines but not yet retreated, and she was running the ventilation sequence and watching the thermal map and accounting for Balthazar's position and trajectory and the remaining threat signatures and the time window before any of this generated the kind of noise that would reach street level. 4 remaining in the north blind spot, she said. You're at the corridor junction, bearing 9 o'clock. They are behind the artifact shelving units, which I cannot see through, but you can likely hear through. A pause. Balthazar. The north blind spot contains the artifact shelving. That is the original horde section. She heard the sound his breathing made on the comm. 11 o'clock, she said. There are 2 of them at 11 o'clock. She kept her voice precisely the same as it had been throughout. Even, clean, informational, without urgency, without heat. The other 2 are at 2 o'clock and have retrieved an artifact case and are attempting to move it to the exit corridor. She pulled up the exit corridor ventilation control. I am sealing the exit corridor now. They are not leaving this building. A beat. Balthazar, you are authorized to use medium-yield fire. I will handle the press. The pause that followed was brief. Then, with something in his voice that she recognized, distantly, as the quality of a thing given permission it had been constraining for a very long time. Understood. What followed on the North Corridor thermal feed required her to update her model a 3rd time, and she did so with the same focused efficiency she'd applied to the first 2 revisions, noting the new data points, the heat signature bloom that expanded well beyond the parameters of human physiology, the way the thermal camera's scale recalibrated to accommodate a source it had not been designed for, the rapid and complete resolution of 4 threat signatures, and filing them, each one, in the same compartment as everything else she had assessed and cataloged, and would examine in depth when the current operational window had closed. The secondary team at the exit corridor encountered the ventilation seal and the tear gas deployment simultaneously, and Balthazar reached them approximately 40 seconds after the North Corridor resolved, and the result was the same as the results that had preceded it. At 12:31, the thermal feed showed 17 stationary signatures and 1 standing one. Sloane took the headset off. She sat for a moment in the quiet of the security control room, the monitors casting their pale light across her face, and looked at the thermal image of Balthazar standing in the center of the vault. The heat distortion around him was enormous on the feed, a bloom of white and orange that the camera was struggling to map, and she could see the slight irregularity of his silhouette, the ways in which it did not match the measurements she had cataloged from months of proximity, before settling, gradually, visibly, the way something very large and very hot cools, back toward its familiar dimensions. He was breathing. On the thermal feed, the heat bloom pulsed with it. The vault was wrecked. Shelving units down, artifact cases scattered, suppressant and tear gas residue fogged in the camera-accessible corridors, and across all of it, the evidence of a force that building materials were not designed to withstand. Dex was staring at the monitors with the expression of a man who had just watched something for which no job description prepared you. Call building security to the sub-level 2 staging area, Sloane said. Do not send them to sub-level 4. She was already opening her folio, already working out the shape of the press response, the cover story, The sequence of calls she would need to make before the city's emergency frequency registered anything from this building. I'll need the building's incident report template. And I need the external communications line. Dex turned to look at her. What, she continued, because she had seen the question forming, do you need from me to do those two things? Dex turned back to his console. On the monitor, Balthazar stood in the wreckage of his vault, in the settling heat, surrounded by the evidence of what he was and what he had done, and the fading glow of eyes that were slowly returning from copper molten to merely copper. And he was breathing in the careful, deliberate way of something managing the edge between two natures. And the vault around him was ruined and intact all at once. Everything taken, still there. Everything threatened, still held. And in the security control .0 room on sublevel 2, Sloane Ellis was already writing the first sentence of the story she would tell the world tomorrow. She wrote, "Subterranean gas leak." She reviewed it. She kept it. She went down at 12:51. Not because the situation had been cleared. She had 17 mercenaries in various states of incapacitation, and a vault that needed a forensic accounting before anyone could determine what, if anything, had been taken or damaged, and none of that was resolved. She went because the thermal feed had not changed in 20 minutes, and what it showed was Balthazar standing in the center of the vault, with a heat bloom that was not diminishing the way it had been diminishing after the last incursion, not cooling back toward its human approximating dimensions, but holding, fixed at a temperature the camera's scale was still struggling to accurately represent, in the posture of something that had passed through violence and come out the other side of it, into a place that was not calm. She had seen enough of him in the past weeks to understand the difference between his anger and his stillness. And what the thermal feed was showing her was neither of those things. It was the specific quality of an ancient thing at the edge of its own management of itself, and she did not think sending building security down in 20 minutes would improve it. She told Dex to hold on the security team, took the stairwell to sublevel 4, and pushed open the door. The heat reached her on the landing. Not the managed, pressurized warmth of the boardroom or the conference room or any of the spaces he inhabited under conditions of relative control, but something unmediated, radiant and total, the heat of a thing not filtering itself. The way the air feels when you open an industrial kiln, the kind that presses against your face and hands and tells your body in the most fundamental possible language, "Do not come any closer." She came closer. The vault corridor was difficult to move through. Suppressant residue coated the floor in pale drifts, and the tear gas had left asting in the air that she registered without flinching, and the shelving units in the outer corridor had been moved by forces that did not match the physics of what a human being can apply to reinforced steel, tilted or toppled at angles that told a story she was very deliberately not spending time analyzing. She stepped around them and moved deeper in. The artifact section was intact. That was the first thing she confirmed with professional efficiency, because it was what she had been most uncertain about, and the answer was important for the incident report. The cases were displaced but present. The relic shelving was damaged but standing, and what had been taken, she could see the empty spaces, was minimal, the work of the secondary team before the exit corridor had sealed. Recoverable, or addressable, or at minimum documentable. She came around the far shelving unit and found him. He was standing with his back to her, facing the far wall of the vault, and the heat from him at this distance was a force that moved against her skin with real physical pressure. The distortion in the air around his body was visible without the camera's mediation. The shimmer she had first seen in the boardroom, amplified, the air itself bending away from him in slow, continuous waves. His shirt had burned off somewhere in the north corridor, and the breadth of his back and shoulders was a landscape of muscle and heat, the skin luminous in the way of metal brought to working temperature. And his hands, she looked at his hands, were fists at his sides, the knuckles wrong in the same subtle way she had noted on the camera feed, and she revised her model again and added the revision to the growing compartment and did not flinch from it. He knew she was there. She was certain of it, because he knew things she could not account for knowing, and because the quality of his stillness had shifted the moment she'd come around the shelving unit. A fractional change, a tightening, the specific stillness of something that is now aware it is being observed. "Balthazar," she said. He did not answer. The heat intensified by a degree she felt across her cheekbones. "I have the incident report drafted," she said. "The cover story is subterranean gas leak. It's credible for this building's age and the sublevel geography, and I have 2 supporting contacts in city infrastructure who can speak to it if the inquiry escalates. The press cycle will be manageable." She paused. "Dex is holding the security team on sublevel 2. No one comes down here until you and I have finished." Silence. The heat pulse of his breathing, visible in the distorted air around him. She stepped forward. She stepped forward until the heat was a wall against her face and her hands and her entire body, until she was close enough to see the detail of his back, the definition of the muscles under that luminous skin, the slow movement of his breathing that was not the breathing of a man at rest. She was close enough now that the warmth coming off him should have been unbearable, and it was not, exactly, but it was the limit of what she could stand without flinching, and she noted the limit and crossed it. She reached up and pressed both hands to either side of his face. He went rigid. A full-body arrest of movement, total and immediate, the way a current stops when a circuit breaks. She felt the heat of his skin against her palms. Genuine heat. The kind that should have burned, that her nervous system sent a very clear message about, and that she acknowledged and set aside. Because this was a problem that required her presence, and her presence required her hands where they were. Her hands were cool. She had noted this about herself before, clinically. She ran cold, always had. The hands and the temperament together. A thing she had been told once was unsettling and had filed under irrelevant. Against his skin they were very cool, and she felt the contact register through the rigidity of him the way a key registers in a lock. Not a turning yet, but a fit. "You're still here," she said. Her voice was the same as it always was, even, precise, without performance. "I need you to come back." A long moment. Then, from somewhere in the deep altered register of his voice, "Ellis." "I'm here," she said. She felt something move through him. Not a sound and not exactly a physical thing, but a change in pressure, a shift in the nature of the heat coming off his skin, the way fire changes quality when you redirect the oxygen source. The rigidity began to resolve, not quickly, not all at once, but incrementally, one locked system after another yielding, the enormous frame beneath her hands settling from the strained stillness of barely contained force into something that was simply weight, simply presence, simply the gravity of a very large person standing in a wrecked room. He turned, not quickly, slowly, with great deliberateness, turning to face her within the bracket of her own hands, and she had to lift them as he turned and then replace them on his face, which was now in front of her, and she did not move back, and she did not lower her hands. His eyes were still lit, not the full copper molten they had been on the thermal feed, but not yet the controlled amber of the boardroom either. Somewhere between, something transitional, and in that light she could see his face in a way she had not seen it before. All the management stripped from it, all the performance of the billionaire, the civilized predator, the man who wore expensive suits and signed documents and sat in meetings. What was left was older and more fundamental than any of those layers and, she registered without particular surprise, still devastatingly composed in its features, in the structure of the bones, in the way the ancient eyes looked at her from the living, luminous face. He was looking at her the way he always looked at her, but more. More direct, more total, more stripped of the careful distance he usually maintained around the things she had observed in him for weeks. The gathering intensity that he had never, until now, fully allowed to surface. "You came down here," he said, and the depth was still in his voice but receding, returning toward its human register. "Yes," she said. "The temperature is manageable." She did not move her hands. "How are you?" The question appeared to require processing. He blinked, and the blink was human, and the light in his eyes was dimmer when they opened again. He was coming back. She could feel it in the cooling of his skin against her palms. Not cold, not approaching any reasonable definition of cool, but less than it had been, the differential between his skin and her hands narrowing in the direction of something survivable. "I should not have." He stopped. "You did what the situation required," she said. "I authorized it. I was watching. The press story is already written." She held his gaze. "You protected the vault. We will address everything else when you are fully regulated." He looked at her for a long time with those returning eyes, and the heat between them was not just temperature anymore, had not been just temperature for some time. And she was aware of it with the same precise, clinical awareness with which she was aware of everything. Filed, assessed, noted, not currently the priority. "Sloane," he said. It was the first time he had used her first name. She lowered her hands. She stepped back one step, a measured step, deliberate, not retreat, and looked at him with that level, pale gaze. And everything in her expression was the same as it always was, and perhaps one thing was different, and she did not examine which thing or what it meant, because the incident report was waiting and the cover story had a 6-hour window, and she had work to do. "Come upstairs," she said. "We have a press cycle to manage." After a moment, he followed her out. The story ran the following morning, as a footnote in the city infrastructure section of 2 metropolitan news outlets, and a brief line in the Obsidian Spire's building management communications. Subterranean gas leak, sublevel infrastructure, no injuries, full structural assessment underway, operations normal. By the afternoon, 2 other larger stories had eclipsed it in the news cycle, and by end of day, it had migrated entirely to the category of things that had happened and been resolved and were no longer generating questions. Sloane marked the coverage summary as closed, filed the incident report with the appropriate parties, and submitted her supplementary billing addendum to Balthazar's accounts team. He paid it the same day, with a marginal note in the remittance that said, "No objections," which was the most accommodating response to an invoice she had received in 9 years of practice. The vault was restored over the following 3 days by a facilities team operating under a non-disclosure agreement that Sloane had drafted herself. The artifacts were cataloged, the cases that had been moved were recovered from where the sealed exit corridor had contained them, and the structural damage to the shelving units was repaired by a metalworker who was told the damage was the result of a pressure event from the gas incident, and who appeared to find this explanation adequate. On the 5th day after the incursion, Balthazar called her to the penthouse. It was the highest floor of the Obsidian Spire, above even the executive level, a space she had not been to before, not because she had avoided it, but because the work had not required it. She rode the private elevator up with her folio and her usual suit, and arrived to find the space considerably different from what she had expected. It was not the monument to acquired wealth she had anticipated, not the explicit display of objects that characterized the offices of men who had something to prove with their possessions. It was full of things, yes, full of the particular density of a space inhabited by someone for whom objects hold meaning, shelves and cases and surfaces covered in items whose age she could sense rather than see. But they were arranged with the care of a person who valued them, rather than the care of a person who valued being seen to value them. It was private. It was the room of someone's actual life. Balthazar was standing near the window, with his back to the room when she entered, and he turned when he heard her. And he was wearing something close to ordinary clothes, dark trousers, a shirt that fit him with the specificity of everything he wore. And his eyes were the controlled amber she had learned to read as his baseline, the color of him at rest, He looked at her for a moment without speaking, and she waited with her folio at her side, and the city of Ethelgard filled the window behind him in its towers and lights, and the room was warm, but not unreasonably so, and the silence was not uncomfortable. He reached into his pocket and produced a key. It was not a modern key. It was long and flat and made of something dark that might have been iron or might have been older than iron, and it had the same quality as the worn lighter, the quality of something handled for a very long time by the same hands, something that had been a daily object for longer than the building it currently belonged to had existed. He crossed the room and stopped in front of her, and without ceremony, without announcement, he reached forward and placed the key in the outer breast pocket of her jacket. She looked down at the pocket. She looked up at him. "That," he said, "is the master key to the vault." He held her gaze. "All of it. Everything in it. The access, the authority, the record." A pause. "I am aware that this constitutes a material transfer of asset control that may have implications for the engagement terms." She reached up and touched the key through the fabric of her pocket with 2 fingers. She held his gaze. "It does," she said. "I expect you will tell me the precise nature of the compliance issue," he said, with something in his voice that was not quite humor and was not quite its absence. Something in between, something new. "I will," she said, "tomorrow." He looked at her. She looked at him. And in the quiet of the penthouse, above the city, with the evidence of 2,000 years of accumulated life arranged on every surface around them, something passed between them that required no document and no contract and no coverage strategy. Something as simple and as final as a thing acknowledged between 2 people who have seen each other clearly and elected, without performance, to remain in the same space. He was the oldest thing she had ever managed, and the most difficult and the most ungovernable, built from fire and instinct and the long, slow accumulation of an existence that predated everything in the world, that she used as her instruments. And she had walked into his burning boardroom on a Tuesday morning and poured ice water on his cuffs and handed him a contract. And he had signed it. And somewhere in the weeks that followed, in the iced coffees and the confiscated lighters and the Island Point rejection and the wrecked vault and the cool hands against a burning face, the thing that had been a professional engagement had become something that her assessment model did not have a clean category for. She was working on one. There are forces in the world that have always existed at the edge of what civilization can manage, ancient and enormous and lit from within by something that destroys everything it touches when it goes unchecked. History is full of the wreckage they leave. What history records less carefully are the ones who did not become wreckage, who found, in the strange arithmetic of the world, the one thing that could meet their fire without flinching, not to extinguish it, not to contain it, but to give it somewhere to land that was not ruin. The most destructive beasts in any story are not destroyed by force. They are not defeated by weapons, or worn down by time, or buried under the weight of the damage they have done. They are stilled, finally and completely, by the one person who looks at everything they are, the age and the heat and the horde and the rage and the ancient terrible need at the center of all of it, and does not step back. They surrender to the one who can manage their chaos, not because the chaos is gone, but because, for the first time in a very long time, they have found somewhere that it is safe to set it down. Balthazar Vance had 3 metric tons of gold in a vault 67 floors below where he stood. He had artifacts that had outlasted empires and titles that predated the countries they were recorded in, and a building that bore his name on every public document. He had hoarded, across 20 centuries, every form of value the world had produced. He had put the vault key in a crisis manager's jacket pocket. He did not want it back. If you loved this paranormal romance, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe so you never miss a new story, and drop your favorite moment from this series in the comments below. Your support keeps these stories coming, and I genuinely cannot wait to read what you think.